So the intake industry is massive. K&N is 250 million approximately annual revenue. There's a bunch of other intake companies out there. And yet intakes are the most hotly debated topic on all forums, comment section, and it's actually one of the reasons we're creating this video. So let's talk about intakes. Hey guys, and welcome back to another Talking Mods. On today's topic, we are going to delve into intakes. Now, intakes are just a basic modification that a lot of us know about, but are always debating. Now, it's a debate that happens here internally at ModBargains. ModBargains is our company. That's our shameless plug. I am the CEO. My name is Ron, and we do sell intakes. We sell them from all different brands. Brands like K&N that I mentioned that started back in 1969 has been selling intakes. But do they work? And what about hot air intakes as it's known? These are the topics I'm going to cover. I'm going to go into it. I'm not going to give you all the engineering, but I'm going to go really deep into it. All right, guys. So intakes, first off, how does it work? The best example I can always use with an intake is to think about the human body. Now, it's a lot like breathing. The intake that we inhale into, the more air that we inhale, the better that we perform. Now, an engine, a car, needs air. We need air in order for combustion. The more air that we have, the bigger the combustion happens, the bigger the horsepower numbers. That's why we have superchargers. Superchargers increase the volume of air that come into the motor and increase combustion. So, best way I can describe is we have our standard intakes that are built on there, right? Now, if I have my intake, this will be my intake tube, and if I go running with this is a straw, obviously. I'm not gonna be able to breathe very well, number one. But now, we're all familiar with these masks, right? And now if I'm gonna add this on top of it here, it's even harder to get air, right? So, an intake will work the exact same way. They're just in a much more dense, and they will go inside an intake tube and flow out. So, it works very much in the similar fashion. Obviously, we don't have combustion that happens, but the more air that we have, the more it travels along our body and the better our muscles can do in performance. The same thing happens here. But it's very critical when we think about this. This example is very critical here. So this would be our intake tube and this would be our filter. Now, filters are available in all kinds of ways. Now, there are oiled filters, which K&N became famous for because they were the first to do it. One of the big benefits for an intake has always been that you could reuse it, you can clean it, and you can basically have it for the lifetime once you make a purchase on that filter. So let's go into do intakes work and what's going on? Why are the horsepower numbers all over the place? Well, they are manipulated by some of these manufacturers. They basically put out different dyno numbers. They control their dyno, right? Now, how are they telling you those horsepower numbers? So when you look at a dyno sheet, it goes by the RPM and the horsepower goes through it. When you look at that, sometimes what they'll do is they'll find that one peak point where there's a big gain. If you were to look at it, it would be like one big gain, like one little point. And then they'll use that to advertise 27 horsepower gain.
Psych!
No, when you're in a certain RPM range, that's the range you should be looking for. Is it making gains? Is it actually happening there? So you got to really look at that in order to understand it and not be fooled by peak horsepower numbers, or whatever they might manipulate. In a vehicle, we have what's called a mass airflow sensor. It is a chip that sits on if we were to talk about an intake, it would be sitting on the tube at the back end of it. Once the air comes in, it reads it, and that information is then sent to the computer's ECU, the brains. And it basically says, hey, we're getting this much air, we can now perform this much better, right? Now, I hope that I can bring someone in here for you guys or go to them and actually have a conversation with these engineers and talk about the different design philosophies and why they chose it. But the basic design philosophy that some brands have is, hey, let's bring in as much air as possible in, which, okay, you brought in as much air, you're sucking it up, and that works, and that can be really, really good. Brands like, I don't want to go into different explain exactly which ones, but if you guys are curious, I will post down in the comments below different philosophies since I've met with a lot of these different companies. There's just a different philosophy. Now, there are different ways in which one can approach these things, and that's a critical factor. The one thing that we got to remember is air comes in, it can also become turbulent. So real engineering, because there's a lot of brands out there that have no engineering being done, and you'll see like a tube and they're like, yeah, I put a filter on it. I put a filter on it and I put a tube and now I've got an intake. Yeah, you did, but you didn't do any engineering here. You didn't make sure that the air wasn't turbulent. That's the difference on why you buy from a brand that you actually recognize as true engineering, a brand like Engine, who is a company that does do it with the mass airflow sensor, which I respect a lot the way they do it. Now, intakes. There are a couple different versions. Again, now one of you viewers has asked me about a hot air intake. Now, there are a lot of different ways in which intakes are presented to you. There is the true cold air intake. The true cold air intake is an intake that is actually a tube that will, let's say this is a tube that will actually go all the way to the bottom of the car and actually feed from the air from the bottom of the vehicle and be as cold as possible, the coldest air it can possibly get, and feed it up into an intake. That is a true cold air intake. We don't see a lot of those being manufactured anymore. The reason being is cost of material, number one. Two, most users don't want to install these because they will have to usually do a cutout and cut into their car, into their bumper, or different sections of it, and so that becomes a little bit messy because people want to sell their car or do returns, so they don't want to run a true cold air intake. You'll see it in race cars, but that's a true cold air intake. So when people talk about cold air intakes, that's a true cold air intake. The other one that's available is what's known as a short ram. Now, most manufacturers are developing just short ram air intakes. They will have a filter, a tube, and bringing in as much as they possibly can. They have no protection around them. And by that I mean that the filter just sits there in the engine. What is the point of having a filter just sit there in an engine when once after 10 minutes of driving, engines are very hot, it gets extremely warm, and all you're doing is now breathing in hot air into these intakes. The vehicle that you have, if it is a naturally aspirated car, meaning you do not have a turbo, it is not supercharged and all that stuff, if it is a naturally aspirated car, it will basically be a detriment. You will lose power. But if you have an intercooler, a good intercooler, not one of the cheaper garbage brands, ones that actually work, then it should theoretically cool down the air well enough that even though it's taking in that hot air and still produce power. Do I like hot air intakes? In my personal philosophy, no, absolutely not, because why make the intercooler work harder? Why put more stress on the other parts if you can get it to be cold, if you can get it to be engineered, if you can get it to not have turbulence, have the air move as best as possible through the system? I think that's better. So I am not a fan of hot air intakes, but I understand that sometimes for value, because materials can be expensive and so forth, and so naturally aspirated, really bad idea. But if it's a turbo vehicle with intercoolers and so forth, it might be okay. So hopefully that explains that. On the other side of all of this, sometimes it's just best to just get a air filter, like a good brand that makes a nice quality filter, a filter that knows what they're doing. A brand that I recommend for a lot of people is BMC. BMC is used by Formula One. We do carry it at ModBargains, so there's our shameless plug there. That's a really nice one, guys. So guys, remember, with intakes and stuff like that, it's pretty simple. Again, just think of the human body. How do we make you perform? It's the same way. Now, a lot of intakes these days are required to have CARB-EO, especially with the EPA. And if you're in California, you definitely need CARB. So look for those on their products. They are being developed. But if they are not available, there's always just getting a good filter like I mentioned. So it is an option for you guys. Anyway, guys, I want to hear what you guys think. I know this is a hot debated topic. I want to hear your comments below. I will be happy to jump in there and get into it. Maybe we'll go even more in a deeper dive when we talk to some of the manufacturers. But guys, I will see you on the next Talking Mods.